begin at the beginning, not just of the Iliad, but of the emotional logic that drives the poem. The first word of the poem is mēnin, rage. Not annoyance, not irritation, not even anger. Rage is something mythic, structural, history-making. And Homer does not bury the lead. He tells us right away, this is a poem about what happens when rage becomes the organizing principle of a society. This is our entry point. And I want you to notice something crucial here. Rage in the Iliad is not treated like a private mood. It is not Achilles sulking in his tent because someone took his favorite bronze mixing bowl. It is treated historically, almost sociologically. Rage that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans. In other words, rage has consequences. Rage produces events. Rage reorganizes reality. And that's important because for many modern readers, particularly those coming to this material for the first time, there's a temptation to read this as a story about great warriors and great deeds and great battles. But the poem starts by saying, no, this is a story about what happens when honor, ego, and authority collide. And when that collision happens inside a military coalition, a fragile alliance of powerful men, the fallout is catastrophic. Now, before we even get to Achilles himself, the poem does something fascinating. It shows us that the crisis begins elsewhere with a priest. Chryses, the priest, does everything right. He comes respectfully, he brings the ransom, he invokes the god, he honors the ritual order. He is the one figure in the opening who behaves like an adult in the room. And almost everyone recognizes this. The soldiers agree, the commanders agree. The right thing to do, socially, religiously, strategically, is straightforward. Return the daughter. Accept the ransom. Avoid divine retaliation. Keep morale intact. But Agamemnon does something revealing. He turns the exchange into a matter of personal dominance. He refuses not because policy demands it, not because strategy demands it, but because his pride demands it. His language is telling, not neutral, not administrative, but humiliating. He imagines her future in detail as domestic labor and sexual property, and he does so publicly. For witnesses. This is the rage of entitlement, the rage of the man in charge who believes that honor flows only one way, toward him. And the poem is very clear. The problem isn't emotion. The problem is humiliation. The priest leaves and he does something that would resonate strongly in an honor culture, like the one we're dealing with here. He doesn't argue. He doesn't retaliate. He appeals to a higher authority. He takes his grievance upward to Apollo. And in that moment, the poem expands. Now rage is not just personal, not just political, but divine. Apollo responds not with a dramatic lightning strike, not with cinematic vengeance, but with something much more chilling. He breaks the system. First, the animals, then the support structure, then the soldiers. The burning funeral pyres begin to fill the shoreline. The point here is subtle, but devastating. Rage moves through a community like a chain reaction. A man is dishonored, a god is invoked. This is where those following along, especially those unfamiliar with classical epic, can start to see what makes Homer so enduring, because this is not a story about warrior culture doing warrior culture things. It is a story about how fragile human communities become when leadership confuses power with prestige. Notice how many different kinds of rage are already present in these first 3 minutes, and we haven't even reached Achilles yet. We have the priest's wounded dignity, the quiet rage of insulted honor, Apollo's cosmic rage, the rage of violated ritual order, Agamemnon's institutional rage, the rage of command without accountability, and soon we will have Achilles' rage, the rage of status, of injured excellence, of someone who believes that if honor is the currency of the world, he has been underpaid. And this is not one man's temper problem. It is a system overheating. One of the most useful ways to frame this for a contemporary audience is this. Rage in the Iliad is not emotional chaos, it is political failure. The poem is not interested in rage as a feeling, it is interested in rage as an event. We could say, and I think this lands well for those of you who are new to this subject, that rage in this poem behaves a bit like a social pandemic. It spreads, it escalates, it reorganizes behavior. It reveals who has power and who doesn't, and the poem wants us to see that long before spears are thrown or horses gallop into battle. The real danger lies in how people handle insult, pride, and dignity. Because once humiliation enters a hierarchy, destruction follows very quickly. If we want a modern parallel without collapsing this ancient world into our own, we might think about institutional spaces we recognize, workplaces where leadership doubles down rather than listens, political movements that fracture because status anxiety outruns shared purpose, collective enterprises that fail not because of external enemies, but because grievances become more important than outcomes. The stakes are higher in Homer, of course. People die, gods intervene, cities burn, but the underlying logic is recognizable. Rage is not irrational. Rage is the expression of hierarchy under stress. And this brings us back to the big question I raised. Is the Iliad a discourse on rage? I think the most productive answer is yes, but it is not rage in isolation. The poem is investigating what produces rage, who gets to be angry, what happens when rage is public, ritualized, and performed, and most importantly, what happens when power refuses to be accountable. Achilles will embody one form of rage. Agamemnon embodies another. Apollo still another. And none of them are purely emotional. They are theatrical. They are political. They are meaningful. Rage becomes a language through which the poem thinks about honor, status, wounded dignity, and the cost of leadership failure. And this is where what I use, my own staged hermeneutics framework, is a strong fit, because rage in the Iliad always is performed before an audience. The priest approaches in ritual posture. Agamemnon rejects him in performative dominance. Apollo responds with cosmic theater. Achilles will withdraw in spectacular world-changing refusal. Each act is staged. Each act is witnessed. Each act has consequences. So when we ask, why read the Iliad today? The answer isn't because it's timeless in some vague moral sense. It is because the poem understands with unnerving precision that communities fracture when humiliation replaces respect as the operating logic of power. And that's not an ancient problem. That's a human one. Now, in this series, as we go book by book slowly, we will keep returning to questions like who is allowed to take offense, who refuses to back down, who bears the cost when powerful people escalate rather than reconcile? Because the Iliad doesn't simply show rage destroying things. It shows rage constructing a world of meaning, violence, loyalty, and grief, and then asks us to sit with the consequences. And that, I think, is where the relevance lies.